Yep.
Great. Well, I'm Mel Fowler Green. I'm the director at the Metro Human Relations Commission. And despite a year of Zooming, I still am apparently subject to forgetting to unmute myself. I want to welcome everybody to this part 2 of our series, The History and Future of Fair Housing in Nashville. This 2-part series is a joint project of the Metro Human Relations Commission and the Tennessee Fair Housing Council. The part 1 focused on the history of fair housing in Nashville, sort of like how we got here. And if you have not seen that or were unable to attend, do not worry. We have a recording. We will share that link with you near the end of today. This evening, we're going to focus on the future. We'll examine some of the barriers we face, think about solutions through an equity lens, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A, the question and answer box, for questions that you might have during the presentation, but also use the chat for comments or input. We'll hope that you're going to leave here in an hour and a half with a better understanding of the Fair Housing Act, the future of the Fair Housing Act, and sort of inspired to do work with all of us to build a more equitable Nashville. Before we go any further, I have a really quick question. A little poll is going to pop up. We're just interested in seeing who's returning from part 1 to part 2. So I'm going to launch this little poll. You all can let us know if you were here with us for the first one. Okay, well, thank you all. That helps us with future planning and also with knowing where to send out the video recordings. This webinar is, as the first one was, being recorded. It's also being streamed live on the Fair Housing Council's Facebook page. We'll send the PowerPoint from this one and the first one to you in the next day or so. And the recording is also going to be posted on the Metro Human Relations Commission site, as well as for the Tennessee Fair Housing Council. And without further ado, I am really honored to introduce Patricia Bell from the Tennessee Fair Housing Council.
Thank you, Mel. So hello, everyone, and happy Fair Housing Month. April 1st starts Fair Housing Month, and I'm really excited to be partnering with Metro Human Relations Commission to talk about the future of fair housing in Nashville, a conversation that's already happening here in Nashville, a conversation that's happening throughout our country. So I'm really excited to begin to have that conversation with you all today. So just a quick disclaimer, Tennessee Fair Housing Council is supported by HUD funding, and HUD requires us to let everyone know that the information you hear today doesn't represent the views of HUD or the federal government. So a little bit about our organization. Tennessee Fair Housing Council was founded in 1995 by the Kentucky Fair Housing Council. We are a very small nonprofit organization with 4 people here on staff, which is our executive director, Kathy Trawick, who you will hear a little bit later, myself, the program manager, our staff attorney, Julie Iriart, and our intake coordinator, Tom Garrison. So we're very small, but we're tasked with the mission of the elimination of housing discrimination in Tennessee. And we do that in a few ways. The first is through education and outreach, which is part of what we're doing here today, and just giving out information to residents about their rights and how to recognize and report discrimination. And then we also do enforcement work. And part of that is we carry out testing, which I'll talk about later. And we provide legal services to prevent and eliminate discrimination in housing practices. Our legal services are free. So unlike other law offices, we don't have any income restrictions. As long as the case is a fair housing case and we take it, our services are free. The jurisdiction, our counties are Davidson and the surrounding counties. So it'd be Davidson, Dixon, Wilson, Williamson, Sumner, Cheatham, Montgomery, and Rutherford. So now, what is fair housing? And we hear conversations about largely relating to housing justice, affordable housing, tenant rights. And we know that there's a legacy of fighting for fair housing, open housing throughout over a century, right? And so what is fair housing, and how does fair housing fit into the larger umbrella of housing justice? So the Fair Housing Act that was signed in 1968 by Lyndon B. Johnson protects people from discrimination when they're renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, engaging in housing related activities. And so in that last part really stretches and reaches so many different markets, right? Because it's engaging in housing related activities. And so when we talk about the Fair Housing Act, we're talking about the protection based on specific classes. And so there's 7 federally protected classes. The first 4, race, religion, color, national origin, were a part of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Sex was added in 1974, and it was folded into the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. And then in 1988, the Fair Housing Act was amended to include familial status and disability. Tennessee has a state statute that includes creed, which is denomination. It could be described as denomination. And then it's important I want to take a second to talk about sex. And so sex includes sexual harassment, and the recent expansion of the definition of sex now covers individuals' gender identity and sexual orientation. And that is attached to the executive order issued from Biden back in January. So it's not an amendment, right? There's legislation currently in Congress, the Equality Act, that would amend the Fair Housing Act to include gender identity and sexual orientation, but currently that expansion of the definition is attached to the executive order. And so I want to also note that we talk about all of these protections in great detail. In any one of these conversations or any one of these classes, we can talk about for over an hour, but I'm not going to get into it in great detail today. I encourage you all that if you're interested, our Fair Housing Matters conference will be May 13th, and we'll definitely send out some information about that. Also, if you're with an organization and you serve people that you believe are facing discrimination or maybe facing discrimination based on one of these protected classes, we will also come out and do a presentation or talk to people in greater detail about these protections. So what's prohibited? In sales or rental, refusal to rent or sell housing, to make housing unavailable, to impose difference in sale prices or rental charges for the sale or rental of a dwelling, to discourage the purchase of a rental or dwelling, is all prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. And that's just part of what is prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. And it's important to note that this is because of the membership of a protected class. So if a landlord would rent to a white family, but specifically won't rent to a Black family simply because they are Black, that would be discrimination. And the person must otherwise be eligible, right? Whether they can't have issues with their credit that doesn't meet the standards or the requirements of that apartment, or they have to be eligible. And this law applies to people that are already living in the unit, as well as applicants are covered by the Fair Housing Act. And that's the same thing when we talk about mortgage and lending. So refusing to make a mortgage loan or to provide other financial assistance for a dwelling, refusing to provide information regarding loans, imposing different terms, conditions on a loan, such as different interest rates or fees, all are covered by the Fair Housing Act, all are prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. But again, the home seeker must otherwise be eligible. So the Fair Housing Act also covers harassment, retaliation, and retaliation against a person that has filed a Fair Housing Act or is assisting in a fair housing investigation, even if the original complaint was not valid. So for example, if a tenant files a complaint against their landlord for discrimination, they file the complaint, HUD sees it, takes it, and they say there's no discrimination that's occurred here. But then the landlord evicts the tenant in retaliation, that tenant would then have a fair housing case, a valid complaint, right? So the retaliation is covered under the Fair Housing Act. Coercion, intimidation, interference, again, in fair housing investigation, and discrimination in advertisement is all prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about fair housing enforcement. So the Fair Housing Act is designed primarily to rely on private enforcement. And so private enforcement is when a potential client contacts our office because they believe they have been treated differently due to their membership in one of the protected classes that I talked about. And so when that case comes into our office, we actually do some investigation. So we do our own investigation, we review the facts, we interview any witnesses, and we will talk to the landlord or housing provider oftentimes. We'll talk a little bit about that because our agency is client-centered, and so we do what is in the best interest of the client. And a lot of times that is talking to the landlord and doing some mediation. We also use other investigative tools. And one of the tools that I'm going to talk to you about today is testing. So what is testing? Testing is the process for and method of ascertaining and measuring the difference in quality, content, and quantity of information and service given to the home seekers by housing providers, either real estate firms, rental owner, property owners, and or management companies, lenders, or insurance companies. So what does all of that mean? Testing helps determine if there's any difference in treatment due to the home seeker's protected class. So testing is often talked about as secret shopping. And so having people come in and see, is there a difference in treatment, right? These otherwise very similar people, same age, same gender, coming in and seeing, but the difference being on a protected class, right? And so seeing if there is a difference in treatment. We don't trick property managers. It's not to set anybody up. It's just to measure and to go in and investigate to see, is this property management real estate agent treating people differently based on these protected classes? So I'm the testing coordinator here at Tennessee Fair Housing Council, and one of the things that we make sure that we talk about often with testers is to be objective. The testers go in blind. They don't know what they're testing for, but we're just going in on our end. We kind of see, okay, was these two testers treated differently? One of the most famous test coordinators is Dr. Martin Luther King. And a lot of what he did in the Chicago Freedom Movement and all that has come out of the Chicago Freedom Movement in testing and sending Black testers or Black people in and seeing, and then sending white people in and then seeing, is there a difference in how people are being treated? And what they found was that there was, and that people would be told, oh, we don't have anything available. The white tester would come in and say, oh, and they would open the books and say, we do have something available, right? And so, and which is still a lot of what we see today. And so I just wanted to talk about Dr. King and the work of Dr. King because he was testing before there was a Fair Housing Act, and testing wasn't approved until 1982. So that was the radical work of Dr. King definitely has helped to shape testing in the work of fair housing organizations now. So HUD also does testing, they call them audits or housing discrimination studies. There have been 4 total housing discrimination studies since HUD's inception. And so those 4 studies were in 1977, 1989, 2000, and 2012. Each of those studies has found discrimination taking place, and they do across the nation something to the effect of 8,000 pair tests to just measure to see throughout different cities to see kind of if discrimination is taking place. And what they find, right, is that the more recent discrimination studies have showed that there's fewer cases of overt discrimination, but still statistically significant forms of discrimination remain in both sales and lending, which is important. I know in our office, we talk about discrimination with a smile, which will be, a tester will go in, might be, a Black tester might go in and you say, oh, hi, how are you? Everything, make small conversation. I'm sorry, we don't have anything available. They'll take your name, they'll take your phone number. We'll call you as soon as we have something available. Then a white tester comes in and, well, yeah, we do. We have stuff available. Come look at this apartment. You want to tour, And so discrimination is, because discrimination occurs in a lot of times these covert ways, people don't know that discrimination is taking place. Research shows that only a fraction of discrimination is reported, whether that's because people don't know or because people aren't talking about it or filing complaints with HUD. It's only a fraction that are reported, which is another reason why testing is so important. In our office, we do systemic testing. So we test out in property management without having a person come in or saying that they necessarily experience discrimination at a property management company. We have the ability to kind of just test different property management companies to kind of see what's going on, and test the market. But even our investigations, research also shows that investigations that include testing are more likely to result in favorable outcomes for the victim. So testing is just so important and a very significant part of what we do here at Tennessee Fair Housing Council, and just a part of the legacy of fair housing in general. So I talked about this briefly before, but our goal is to always work with our clients and to achieve our clients' goals. And so whether that's to retain the housing, so for them to stay in the housing that they're in, or whether that's to relocate without a penalty. We talk to our clients and see what they want to do, and then we're client-centered and trying to carry out what's best for the clients that we serve. And sometimes it is all that the client needs is a lawyer or someone to kind of come in and intercede and do that mediation piece with the landlord to come to some resolution. And sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, and we do have to go to court. But we definitely try to make sure we're doing what's in the best interest of our clients. And so with private enforcement, the complaint is filed, or our organization will take a complaint to HUD or to the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. And we can also file a lawsuit in federal or state court. Again, please reach out to our office if you feel like you've experienced discrimination, if you believe discrimination is taking place. And this is something that our attorneys can talk about, where to file the complaint and what, talking through your best interests. So that's something that we definitely take seriously. And please reach out if you believe you've experienced any discrimination. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our executive director, Kathy Trawick, and she's going to talk about some impediments to housing in Nashville and also some policies in other cities.
Thank you, Patricia. And as she said, my name is Kathy Trawick. I'm the executive director. I've been here going on 4 years now. And so this time we wanted to drill down and talk a little bit more about Nashville and what's going on in Nashville. Mel made a comment in the chat that you can also file a complaint with the Metro Human Relations Commission. So be sure to reach out to them also as another alternative. So there we go. So HUD has always required that cities and metropolitan areas that receive federal funding do an assessment of fair housing. And what they're looking at is what are barriers to fair housing. Now, over the last 10 years, or 12 years, this has gone through quite a metamorphosis. And right now it's somewhat left with the way the last administration had made some changes. But what I'm going to talk about right now is the assessment of fair housing that MDHA did in 2017. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And they were required to look at several areas. They had to analyze the segregation and integration, racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, disparities in access to opportunity, disability, and access. And so with segregation and integration. Now, if you were with us the last time, you will recognize that map that's on the left. But in their evaluation of segregation, the 2017 AFH found that North Nashville and Bordeaux are concentrated Black communities, and white populations are concentrated in areas to the south of downtown and in more rural areas. The map on the right shows the census block demographics with majority white communities indicated in the blue, with darker blue indicating more concentrated white populations. And the orange signifies Black populations, and the darker areas of orange, again, is the greater concentration of Black population. So if you compare these two maps, I wanted to put them side by side, because if you compare the two maps, you can see that not a whole lot has changed. The population, of course, has grown and spread out, but this redlining where organizations were not able to make loans, where it was risky, it was hazardous to make loans, it's still, a lot of it is still the same. So the next area that they looked at was racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And what that is, that's a deeper dive into segregation, and they look at census tracts which have a non-white population of 50% or more, and the poverty rate exceeds 40% or more for individuals living at or below the poverty line. And those are indicated in red. That's kind of an overlay of on the last map. And remember, the orange was about the same, very similar to what we've seen since the 30s. So that kind of tells you that things, unfortunately, the concentration of poverty and they call them recaps, but that hasn't changed a whole lot. There are 19 recaps in Davidson County, and Davidson County is the only county in the MSA with concentrated areas of poverty. All the recaps except one are located in highly segregated African American communities. There's one that's located in Antioch, which is in an area with a high concentration of Hispanic and immigrant populations. So these maps that we've seen, the two on the last slide and this one, show that Nashville has fallen into what we call a pattern of perpetuation of segregation. And that's not unique to Nashville. A lot of cities have done that. So factors that contribute to recaps, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I want to talk about 3 of them because they are unique, or they're similar to all of them. And so the lack of the location and type of affordable housing, the loss of affordable housing, and source of income discrimination. And those tend to recur in several of the areas that they evaluated. Disparities in access to opportunity. So oftentimes you'll see that in recap areas, areas of high concentration of poverty or racially concentrated areas, you'll see that there are no bank branches, no grocery stores with healthy food. A lot of times those areas are located over old hazardous waste, environmental. There used to be a bad polluting factory there. And so that's where they put a lot of those families in those houses. But again, if you look in here, the loss of affordable housing, the location and type of affordable housing, and source of income discrimination are all in that also. Disability and access. Now, a lot of people confuse the Fair Housing Act and ADA. And ADA is for public spaces. And so there's an overlap because in an apartment complex, you're going to have some public areas, the office, the pool, the parking lot, all of those are public areas. So in those situations, ADA and fair housing overlap. But when we're talking about fair housing, we're also talking about where the housing is located. Is there access to transportation for people with disabilities? So can they catch a bus with a wheelchair ramp? Where can they get where they need? Are there housing? Is there housing that's accessible? And when I talk about that, I think about what's going on in Nashville with all where they're knocking down the old houses and building the tall and skinnies. And so you don't have a bedroom or a bathroom on the first floor. Suppose that person is in a horrible car accident, or suppose that they end up with a disability that gives them a physical impairment. Basically, they have to move because there's not a way to make that house accessible. And so that's something that we encourage organizations who work with builders, who build new housing, new affordable housing. I understand totally that the cost of land in Nashville is outrageous, and there's a need to make the most of the footprint and get the most housing. But there should be a way, instead of making the tall and skinnies all side by side, if some of them could be stacked so that at least the bottom, unit would be accessible. The other thing is, you know, people buy these and they don't think about it, but if their parents want to come visit or their grandparents, they're not going to be able to come. Or if they have friends that have a mobility impairment, you know, are you going to put your mom on the couch? I mean, it's just something that a lot of people don't think about. And so I think it's important for everyone to think about visitability, because at some point in our lives, we're all going to experience some sort of mobility impairment, whether it's early on because of a tragedy, or if it's later in life and we're lucky enough to live that long and to hang around. And so it's a big issue. And that was one of the things, the barriers, if you look at this list of contributing factors to lack of access. And then also, again, the loss of affordable and accessible housing. And because a lot of people who have vouchers or who live in subsidized housing are people with disabilities. I did work at a housing authority in another city for 13 years in their voucher program. So I know what it's like for people with disabilities and a very limited income to find something that fits within the rent range for the vouchers. Let's see. So a minute ago, I mentioned perpetuation of segregation. And that is all of those factors that come together, work together to perpetuate the segregation in Nashville and in other cities. You know, back in the day, I'm old enough and lived in rural West Tennessee, and the expression across the tracks was literal. And you could drive through the small towns, and when you crossed the tracks, there was a definite difference in the housing. And today, you may not be crossing railroad tracks, but it's still there because we've seen it in the statistics and the mapping. And we're looking at losing affordable housing. We're looking at, you know, where things can be located. Oftentimes, people in communities have a misunderstanding of what affordable housing really is. And I think it may be being brought home a little bit more after the pandemic, and so many people who've always worked suddenly found themselves without jobs. And then again, what we talked about earlier, if there are no bank branches in the neighborhood, if there's no food, no grocery stores where they can get healthy food, yeah, there will be lots of fast food places or convenience stores, but they need and are entitled, everyone is entitled to having the healthy food available to them. So I want to talk a little bit about source of income protection. I want to talk about what it is, but I also want to talk about what it isn't. There's a lot of misunderstanding that some landlords think that if source of income protection is passed, they won't have a choice. They'll have to rent their $2,000 a month property to someone with a Section 8 voucher. Well, first of all, that person with the Section 8 voucher is probably just as nice and clean, and they would make a great neighbor. They just have fallen on some hard times. But also, some landlords will say they don't want to fool with vouchers because they have to make repairs that fit what the housing authority is requesting. Well, having worked in a housing authority for 13 years, I know that the repairs are not that great, and they're not unreasonable, I should say. And what that used to tell me, and I would tell my tenants, my clients with vouchers, if he doesn't want to make these basic repairs, do you really want to live in that property? So source of income protection just means that the landlord cannot simply deny housing just because the person is a voucher holder. They can do background checks. They should do background checks. I used to tell my landlords, of course, in West Tennessee, where I was, it was a much smaller market and not so many people, but I would tell them to go do a home visit, see how their housekeeping is. But if whatever checks they make for all of their tenants, for their other tenants, they can do the same thing for voucher holders. And it's important. So the Section 8 program was developed so that people could get out of public housing and have choice, and have a choice of where to live. Now, of course, we all know that rents in Nashville are extremely high. And so obviously a person with a Section 8 voucher is not going to be able to live just anywhere, because it's not going to let them rent something that's over the rent range of their voucher. I did some math last night, and I used a a 4-person family, and I looked up the income limits for someone who would qualify for a voucher. And then I did the calculations of how much someone in Tennessee might get on unemployment to see, how it balanced out, because that's your, 2 parents, 2 children, both parents work, they both lose their jobs due to COVID. So they've got to figure out what they're going to do, because maybe their jobs will come back, maybe they won't. But they live in a house where the rent is affordable. It's a moderately priced house. And what I found out was, if both parents were getting the maximum amount of unemployment, because you may or may not know that in the Tennessee maximum amount of unemployment is $275 a week. It doesn't matter if your salary was $100,000, you're going to get $275 a week, and that's before taxes. If you tack on the $300 a week that unemployment is now, I know at first it was $600, then it was $400, now it's $300. But with the $275 and the $300, that family of 4 falls under the income limits for receiving a Section 8 voucher. So let's pretend that there is a voucher available, which there very rarely are. But let's pretend that there was one available, and the family lived there. They'd always paid their rent before COVID, and the landlord says no just because they have a voucher. And we're not putting race or anything else into it. If there was source of income protection, then this family would still be able to live there. I want this map right here. I admit Patricia pulled this map together, and I was quite amazed. And Patricia, tell me would you jump in and say exactly what the red circles are and the orange circles?
Yeah, I can jump in and talk a little bit about the map. So the map shows the orange circles are per 200 voucher units. So what we're seeing here is that the vouchers, those that have vouchers in the Davidson County area, are in the predominantly Black areas that mimic the previously redlined areas. The red circles are per 1,000 units, the space that the voucher could afford to live, right? So someone with a voucher, if you look at where the red circles are, could live anywhere with those red circles. So what Kathy was talking about with the, it's not over rent, the voucher would cover that space, but because discrimination exists due to source of income discrimination, landlords can say, we don't want you to live here if you have a voucher, right? And so that's what we're looking at is spaces and areas where the voucher would be able to be used, and where it's currently being used now is represented with the orange dots.
Thanks, Patricia. And I checked, and MDHA doesn't track it, but I know for sure that they feel like that approximately 30% of people who get a voucher lose it because they can't find anything. And that leads to homelessness. It does not allow anyone to break the cycle of poverty, because that's what housing choice vouchers do. The person has to usually pays a portion of their rent, but it allows them to pay a smaller portion of their rent and begin to save money because they're responsible for utilities, a yard. It's the ability to start gaining wealth, and they have the opportunity to save money, and housing authorities have different programs that allow people sometimes to even buy homes. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes the opposition to source of income protection is a proxy for race, because statistically, the majority of low-income people are minorities, Black, Hispanic, but people with disabilities. So, and that's the other thing, a person with a disability that can't find housing because they can't find anything that's accessible. If we had source of income protection, it would allow that person to access a lot more of the housing stock, and they would be less likely to lose their voucher. We had a client today, not in Davidson County, in another county, and she lost her voucher because she couldn't find anything. I used to know the statistic of homeless people, and I didn't have a chance to check with Open Table, but I know there's an alarming number of people who are homeless. They get a voucher, but for whatever reason, they're not able to find something, and they end up still homeless. I don't know, Mel, do you know that statistic?
I do not.
Okay. That was on my list, but I didn't make it that far down on my list. But it's an alarming amount. Can you imagine someone who, and especially with the law that they just passed in Tennessee that makes it illegal for someone to sleep under a bridge or on any public property. So, you know, they get a voucher, but for whatever reason, and it could be a discriminatory reason, but that's a whole nother presentation. But yeah, so they can't find anything, so they're still homeless. And there's an alarming number of those that die because they are on the streets and they die before they can find something. So oftentimes the opposition to source of income is a proxy for race. You know, NIMBYism used, not in my backyard, it used to always be talking about group homes, but these days it can be affordable housing, it can be source of income protection, because they assume that someone who has a voucher is not going to be a good neighbor. And the thing about that is they'll lose their voucher if they don't take care of the house, if they don't take care of the property. And those things are like gold. If you get one, you don't want to lose it, that's for sure. So a little bit about COVID-19 and fair housing. Because of the quarantine, a lot of people are on edge. I'm sure that we've all felt it, like, please, I've got to get out of here for 15 minutes. Just don't talk to me. My name is not Mom anymore. I've changed it, and don't talk to me. But what this has also done, unfortunately, is in circumstances where there is domestic violence, sexual harassment, you know, women get behind on their rent because of their job and their landlord wants a little something something to wipe out the rent. We've seen some of the fair housing organizations, as it's been on the news, has seen an increase in violence against Asian Americans. And then we also have heard on the news that Indigenous, Black, and Hispanic individuals are about 3 times more likely to be hospitalized as a result of COVID-19 compared to their white counterparts. There's been a lot of research about that, and sometimes it has to do with the fact that they have jobs where they were unable to stay home and work from home, so they had to go to work, or the concentration of housing put many of those individuals closer together, where those of us who live in the suburbs, we could stay all nice and cozy in our little house, and we didn't pass people in the hallways when, you know, just going in and out. But there's also been a lot of, an increase in domestic violence, and both on women and on children. because children could go to school and that was their safe place. But if the abuser is home all the time with the spouse or the children, then that just leads, it offers more of an opportunity. Also, it's not on the slide, but if sometimes COVID has had has horrible side effects for people, and they have ongoing breathing problems. They have many residual problems. It can affect their heart. And so they just end up as a person with a disability under fair housing. And so they're entitled to other protections. Also, we've had instances where landlords have, when someone has recovered from COVID, and we had one who went into an office with a mask on, but had said, you know, she'd gotten out of the hospital, she was cleared, but they all backed up and they treated her, they ostracized her and treated her like she was a leper. And so there have been a lot of residual effects in housing from the COVID-19, and I think they'll probably go on for a while. So the next part is something that's kind of new in the forefront. Well, it's been around for a while, but some cities have started really talking about it. And I don't have answers, and I'm not speaking for or against it. This is the part where we want to kind of hear your thoughts, hear from you. Mel, I'll probably get you to jump in, but reparations. So I pulled the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, and it's the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money or otherwise helping those who have been wrong. The courts required a convicted offender to make financial reparation to his victim. So a lot of cities, states, groups have started calling for reparations. And, you know, there's been a huge awareness in the country over the year for racial equity. And, you know, equity is not always equal. It doesn't necessarily mean equal. It's equitable. And, you know, in a survey, just 20% of respondents backed using taxpayer money to pay damages to descendants of enslaved people in the United States. But again, these are some communities that are calling for reparations. And Gavin Newsom in California has signed a bill establishing the nation's first task force to study and make recommendations on reparations for slavery. And the city of Providence created an executive order promising truth, reconciliation, and municipal reparations. So they don't have to, it's not necessarily money paid to people, because that's kind of, you know, where do you start? And by the time it gets watered down to all the descendants of slaves, it might not make as much of a difference as an investment. And the last webinar that we talked about, and Mel, I don't know, do you know those statistics off the top of your head, the people that were displaced and the loss of the Black farmland?
I don't have it right at hand, but during our the first part of this two-part series, I did provide a lot of those statistics, along with statistics around the number of families, particularly Black families, who were displaced through urban renewal.
Right. And that's what, so Evanston, Illinois has voted to distribute $25,000 to 16 eligible Black households to use for home repairs as down payment or as down payments on property. And the funds come from a new tax on legalized marijuana. And they have pledged to distribute $10 million over a decade. It says around 16% of the city residents are Black. Now, that's just one case study. So this is where I wanted to get some conversation going, because in the last presentation, we talked about the urban renewal that has happened in Nashville. And that's kind of why I chose these two photos to go in here, because that's a picture of the Capitol. And in, I guess, what, the 60s, before urban renewal, and that comes down to the Bicentennial Mall, those were neighborhoods, and they were majority Black neighborhoods, and they were forced to move because of urban renewal. So even if you don't go back to slave times, if you look at the harm that has been done in Nashville to families who were forced to move in the guise of urban renewal, you know, what might they look like? You know, I don't know. I just want people, my goal for this is to just get people thinking about it. Would it be direct payments to compensate for lost property? Would it be investments in marginalized community? Would it be source of income protection to increase housing opportunities? So this is where I want to open up the chat, and someone in here is has just said something about they love the idea of source of income protection. I can tell you this, that there was a bill. What made me think about this is there was a bill introduced at the state level for source of income protection, but I haven't been able to find out the exact status of it right now. So I'm not lobbying. We're not allowed to lobby. If you have an opinion on it, you know, you might do your research and you might talk to your legislators. I personally think that education is very important when you talk about source of income protection, so that people understand what it is and what it isn't. It would also prevent, it would go into people wanting to buy a home and they draw disability, and their disability is plenty. I mean, they would be otherwise eligible. And it right now, they can't deny the person because they draw disability, but this source of income protection would be an extra hammer in the toolbox. Okay, so Mel, you want to read some of the chats, and let's see what people are saying, or we could let people unmute. Let me finish this last little bit, last slide on the presentation, and we've got plenty of time. We can let people unmute, or, you know, we can read some of the chat, but I'd love to have a conversation on it. I was looking at this picture of the skyline. I was thinking it must be old, but I do see some cranes in there. You know, an old picture, if it doesn't have 10 cranes in the photo, it might be an older photo. So this is a quote that Patricia found, but the last presentation that Mel gave most of it, and she titled it "The Past is Prologue." And when this quote was in here, it really made me think, and it really fits what we're talking about today. History is not a static moment or series of moments. History is an ongoing project that connects past generations to the present, and it is built by human beings who make choices about what we admit to, what we ignore, what we celebrate, and what we condemn. And that got me to thinking, you know, we're at a point, kind of at a point of reset because of the pandemic. And so we have the opportunity now to make some decisions and make choices. And how do we want our grandchildren and future, how do we want history to remember us and think about, you know, and look back and say, well, they could have done this, but they didn't. So, and I'm not closing out because we've got plenty of time. We've got time to talk, but I want to, right now, while I'm thinking about it, thank the Metro Human Relations Commission, thank Mel. Patricia did a great job with the research on this. And so I want to thank them for putting this together. And I want to give control back so that Patricia can close out the PowerPoint and we can lead a discussion about this.
So Kathy, there were a couple of questions that came up during the presentation, some of which I answered, you know, at the time. But there were a couple that I thought it might be good for you to hear and maybe speak to. And one of those was any prospect of regulating the production of the tall and skinnies that don't provide accessibility. And quite honestly, I don't know what that would look like. And I wondered if you had done any research.
No, that of course would be a zoning issue. And as we know, unfortunately, a lot of the communities in this area didn't have zoning requirements. They attempted to do some overlays, and some of that worked and some of it didn't. It's really kind of a building, you know, working with builders and raising awareness, because if the community, you know, I don't think that, and we know that in Tennessee, you cannot enact an ordinance in a city if it's not, if it goes against a state law. And so I don't think there's much of a chance unless the codes, unless the zoning changes it, but I don't know that there's an argument, a legal argument for it. I think there's a moral argument for it. So I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Another question that I have actually is some clarification, like how often does MDHA do the assessment of fair housing? And I know from some of the fair housing work that I've been doing over the last few years that other cities have seen a significant increase in community participation in that process, right? Community saying, we want to be a more important and active partner in doing that assessment of fair housing. And I'm not afraid to say that's exactly what I would like all of us to say together, right? That we all want to have greater community participation in that assessment of fair housing. But I'm also interested in hearing like what's the benefit of our greater participation in that process?
Well,
and before you answer, let me say, like, I do know of at least one example where community advocates coming out of that process were able to secure micro grants for smaller grassroots organizations to do fair housing education and fair housing work, which I thought was really exciting.
yes, yes. So cities, and in this case, in a lot of cases, it's the housing authority that does the assessment of fair housing, but not always. In some places, hire consultants to write it. In the city where I was before, they hired a consultant, and we went in, and several of us from legal services where I worked, several people in the community, we went in, and another attorney and I talked about visitability and all of that, and that never showed up in their AI. So yeah, that wasn't even on there. I will also say that housing authorities, there's a cycle, and I think it's every 3 years, 5 years. Yeah, 5. I think it's 5 that you have to do a big assessment. And then they have an annual thing that they do. But
Yes.
yeah, it's 5 years for the big ones. And in 2017 is when MDHA's, when Nashville's was due. And keep in mind, it's not just it wasn't MDHA, it was Nashville. And so I will say, because that's the first time I've ever really been involved, and I will say that they had a number of focus group meetings where they invited particular people to come and brainstorm. There were idea dumps. I mean, just really throwing things out there and people taking notes and getting information. I don't know how other cities do it, because I know in my other town, if they put it out there in the community to come and make comments and talk about it, nobody, most of the time I was the only person there. Nobody came. So I was kind of amazed that they did this and really sought, there were people from the community, and they did put it out there for comment, so that the general public could comment also. And I think they probably had some sessions, but then they also had sessions with specifically invited people to get a broad view, a broad slice of the different organizations that deal with housing in Nashville. So, but I think it's important. Community involvement is so important, but I don't know that there's enough knowledge that it's going on. Yes, they put it out there, but where is it advertised? Recently I've learned that radio stations are not always required to run PSAs anymore. There's not that requirement like it was. So I don't know, but it's extremely important to get the word out there and for people to voice their opinion, like you said, because sometimes you get these little micro grants.
Yeah, and so the last one was done in 2017. So next year, if my math is correct, we're going to be embarking on our next assessment of fair housing here in Nashville. And so I really want to encourage everybody to start to gear up to
Right.
participate in that process. And I think that one thing I would like, to continue to work with you all, Kathy, on like what are the actual benefits that might come from that community investment in that time and that engagement, right? Like what are the possibilities?
Right.
How can we do things differently? How can we get from that process some concrete results for the community? And I think that would be really great.
So the question about who handles it, is it made by HUD or the city? I think it's who gets the CDBG money, the Community Development Block Grant money. And in Nashville, that's a branch of MDHA, because MDHA, I'm learning, like HUD, has all these little different departments. And so it's separate from the subsidized housing part of MDHA. It's its own little entity, but it is the city. And it's a really hard concept to grasp.
Well,
You might
it's
be
kind
able
of complicated, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
complicated here because, right, our housing authority is not a like full metro department or city entity, right?
Right, because they are funded by HUD.
And that's right, and that's not necessarily the model that you see across the country.
No. And it was always difficult for me to explain to people when I did work at that housing authority that I was not a federal employee, a city employee, a state employee. I was a housing authority employee, and we were funded mostly by grants from HUD. And similar to here, we get federal money, but we are not federal employees. So let's see.
I do want to also say that with regard to quote unquote reparations ideas, I do want to highlight that there is a new project here in Nashville. And it is a project called Moving Nashville Forward. It's a guaranteed basic income pilot in North Nashville in 37208 zip code.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to hear about that project. There's been great success internationally in guaranteed income projects. And then here in the US, there have been a few pilots. And so I just wanted to highlight that for folks because I think that the pilots in other parts of the country have really shown some great results at disrupting poverty.
Okay. And
And
that's what this is about.
right,
Is
and
not,
Melissa just posted the website for Moving Nashville Forward. If you're all interested in learning more about that.
okay, cool, because the misnomer is that when you help someone else build wealth, you're pulling yourself down. And that's not, it's like in a workplace, if a boss feels like they have to make themselves look good by pushing their people down, that's not a healthy work environment, because what they don't understand is that bosses who lift their people up just look, their people shine, their staff shines. And it's the same with building wealth and communities. If you help people out of poverty, you're not going to lose anything yourself. You're just helping other people up where the whole city benefits.
I think that's right. I think that there's a lot of sociological evidence that narrowing the the wealth gaps and income gaps in communities actually increases economic development across the entire community. But I also think that what's fascinating about the guaranteed income pilots is disrupting this notion that people who have navigated poverty for many years can't manage their money. I mean, let's be clear. If you have navigated poverty for years, I think that you may be the absolute expert at how to spend your money, what to spend your money on. And I think that the data that's coming out of these pilots are just backing that up. And so I'm really thrilled that there's going to be an opportunity to sort of that proof of concept right here in Nashville.
I think it's really exciting. I'm going to have to learn more about that. I haven't heard about that yet. But I want to learn more about that. I'm excited. But yeah, I think it's just so important. And we have this opportunity right now because the country is so aware with everything having been shut down. I think a lot more people are more socially aware, especially after what happened last summer to George Floyd, and then the series of events. I think it has raised awareness of there's a lot more going on in life than our little circles. And I include myself because, we get focused on, we go to work, we come home, we do whatever, and we're not always as aware of what's going on.
So in the chat, there's another question.
Okay.
The participatory budgeting pilot project mentioned by the mayor in budget talks. So that is a different thing than Moving Nashville Forward.org, which is a private project. But participatory budgeting is a method of engaging the community in how we want to see our public money spent through our budget. It is, it's a little more community hands-on than simply lobbying or communicating with your council member who has a vote on the budget, right? This is actually going to the community and saying, look, here's this pot of money. How would you want it spent? And this is not necessarily a new concept. Again, this is something that other cities have been doing. I am also thrilled to hear the mayor's office float the idea, and council members who have been really great at advocating for participatory budgeting. And so that's a separate matter, but again, that's another great opportunity for community to be engaged in building a more equitable Nashville.
And like Patricia said in the beginning, we will be having, last year we weren't able to have our Fair Housing Matters conference, but this year we are. April is Fair Housing Month, but there were so many events scheduled in April that we chose to put ours in May so that maybe it won't be competing with so many events. We'll be sending out more information, and we'll send out information to everyone who attended and registered for these webinars. Also, Patricia has been telling me about something that's sounds very interesting called PATH. Is that right, Patricia? Can you tell them about that?
Yeah, and Melissa's putting, if she can put something in the chat, PATH is having ongoing conversations, very similar to what we're talking about. We're diving into the history, talking about what the future will look like, and doing some insight and some storytelling. So we only had you here for an hour and a half, so we definitely can't get as deep into the history, future, and kind of what's going on in the community, but I definitely would recommend plugging into PATH and reaching out to Melissa. It's been a great space so far. We've just started conversation. So I recommend, if you're interested in what we're talking about here and future for Nashville, to plug into those conversations as well.
Yeah, I know everybody gets tired of Zoom, Zoom fatigue, but honestly, it has allowed me to attend more trainings than I would have been able to, and participate in more workshops than I would have been able to. It has allowed my staff, because we have very little money for training, to attend more conferences. So while I miss people and hugging people and touching people and being in the same room as they are, I foresee, at least for us, moving, when we are allowed to be in the same room with other people, a hybrid where we're allowed to continue with the Zoom webinars as well as in person. But other than thanking everyone for attending, and Patricia and Mel for all their hard work on these two webinars, and reminding people that the recordings will be available on our respective websites, plus our different social media sites. Patricia and Mel, were there any final questions or any final questions or any thing else in the chat or the Q&A? There was something in the Q&A. Did we
I feel like we We did the best we could at answering the questions that came up in the chat and in the Q&A. And if not, you are all more than welcome to email or call me, Kathy, Patricia. We're happy to steer you in the right direction to the best of our ability.
Yes.
We also want to encourage you to invite us to your community events, right?
Yes.
You're talking about housing. We want to learn from you, and we're happy to bring our knowledge, but we also just want to learn from you. So please continue to invite us.
Yes. And, you know, we're always willing to collaborate. How can we help you? How can we help your clients? How can we teach you to help your clients better? Patricia?
No, just thank everyone for coming. And as we continue this conversation, like Kathy and Mel said, please reach out to us. If you're interested in volunteering with Tennessee Fair Housing Council, please reach out to me. And thank you for coming.
Yeah, and I think we can make the presentation available to the people who attended. We can copy the PowerPoint and email it out if they're interested. Also, one last little bit of housekeeping. Because we are funded by grants, HUD cares who attended, and we care how we did and what you want to see. And so if I did this right, this is my first webinar that I actually put together. If I did it right, you're going to get a survey when the webinar is over with, which is basically an evaluation. It's anonymous. And we want to know how we did, but also what can we do? How would you like it? Because shoot, we got this Zoom thing. We can put together some webinars and reach out and, you know, so please fill out. It won't take you but just a few minutes to fill it out. And please take a minute while everything's fresh on your mind and fill it out for us, because we really want to know what we can do to make it better.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And we will send you all the link to the first in the series, which is the history, and this one, so you can share it with your colleagues, friends, your community, if you think that this information would be helpful for them too.
Yes, knowledge is power. All right, thank you so much.
Be safe, everyone.
And thank you for our interpreter too. We appreciate your work and you did such a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.